You should start getting used to letting Sophie make family decisions now, my husband said over dinner, swirling red wine in his glass as if he hadn't just erased me from my own life. I looked up slowly from my plate, certain I had misheard him. The dining room suddenly felt too quiet, too polished, too perfect. The soft jazz playing from the kitchen speakers only made the silence at the table feel colder. Richard sat at the head of the mahogany table we bought 27 years ago in Connecticut, wearing the same calm expression he used in courtrooms during his years as a corporate attorney. Across from him, Sophie lowered her eyes and smiled into her napkin like she was trying to hide embarrassment, but there was something rehearsed about it, something careful. Daniel kept eating without looking at either of us. My own son couldn't even raise his eyes from his steak. "I'm sorry," I asked quietly. Richard leaned back in his chair. "The family trust, the properties, future planning. Sophie has a better understanding of these things than you do now. The words landed gently, but they cut deeper than shouting ever could. I folded my linen napkin carefully onto my lap and glanced toward the binder sitting beside Richard's elbow. Black leather, gold trim, Carter Family Trust embossed across the front. I had seen that binder for years. Richard never let it leave his office. Tonight was the first time he had casually placed it on the dinner table, like I no longer mattered enough to hide it. Sophie finally spoke, her voice sweet and polished. "We just want to make things easier for you, Evelyn. You've been under so much stress lately." Stress. That was the word everyone started using once a woman passed 65. It didn't matter that I still ran charity boards, organized fundraisers, or managed an entire household while Richard spent most evenings behind closed office doors. Suddenly I was fragile, emotional, difficult. "I didn't realize my family needed new management," I said with a faint smile. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Sophie reached for Richard's arm then, lightly touching his sleeve for half a second too long. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but I did. I noticed everything that night. The way Richard softened when she spoke. The way Daniel stayed silent whenever Sophie interrupted me. The way nobody asked if I wanted more wine, even though I had hosted dinners in that house for almost 30 years. I suddenly felt like a guest sitting at my own table. Richard opened the binder casually, flipping through documents while continuing to eat. "There are a few adjustments we've been discussing," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." Adjustments. I stared at the pages from across the table, trying not to react. Then I saw it. My name. Crossed out in blue ink. Not removed entirely. Just replaced line by line beside several trust holdings and property documents. Sophie noticed my eyes linger too long. She immediately closed the binder with a soft laugh. "Oh goodness, Richard. Must we talk business during dinner?" But it was too late. My chest tightened as a strange calm settled over me. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Something quieter. Outside the dining room windows, snow drifted softly across the backyard patio lights. The Carter home looked beautiful from the outside. Warm. Elegant. Untouchable. But sitting there beneath the chandelier, listening to my husband discuss the future of our family with my daughter-in-law, while my son stared silently at his plate, I realized something terrifying. I was disappearing from my own life. And the worst part was that they already believed I was too old to notice. That night, after everyone went upstairs, I stayed alone in the dining room long after the candles burned low. The house sounded different now. I had lived there for nearly 3 decades, long enough to recognize every sound the old place made in winter. The heating vents rattled softly near the staircase. The grandfather clock in the hallway clicked with perfect precision. Wind brushed lightly against the windows overlooking the backyard. But underneath those familiar sounds was something new. Distance. I sat there staring at the empty wine glasses while Sophie's perfume still lingered faintly in the air. Vanilla and jasmine. Too young for a house like this. Too bright. Richard had once told me he hated strong perfume because it distracted him when he worked. Funny how people rewrite themselves when they stop loving you. Upstairs, I heard quiet footsteps crossing the hallway above me. Then a soft laugh. Hers. A few seconds later came the sound of Richard's office door closing. I looked slowly toward the ceiling. His office had become off-limits over the past year. At first, he claimed he needed privacy for retirement consulting work. Then he added a keypad lock to the door. A keypad lock inside our own home. I remembered laughing about it at the time. What are you hiding in there? I had teased. Richard barely looked up from his laptop. Taxes. Legal paperwork. Things you would find painfully boring. Back then, I believed him because after 41 years of marriage, trusting him had become automatic. Like breathing. I finally stood and began clearing the dinner plates myself because Sophie had stopped helping after she moved into the guest house 6 months earlier. Technically, she and Daniel were renovating their condo downtown. At least that was the story everyone repeated. But renovations that were supposed to last 6 weeks had somehow stretched into half a year. Sophie slowly started taking over spaces in my home, one room at a time. First it was the pantry, then the laundry schedule, then holiday planning. Last Thanksgiving, she changed the seating arrangement without asking me and laughed when she placed me at the far end of the table beside Daniel's business partner instead of next to Richard. I thought this would flow better socially, she had said brightly while adjusting the centerpiece. Richard agreed without even looking at me. Little things. Tiny humiliations. The kind that sound ridiculous when spoken out loud but slowly hollow you from the inside. I opened the refrigerator and carefully placed leftovers into glass containers. Richard used to tease me for labeling everything with blue painter's tape and neat black marker dates. You run this kitchen like a military operation, he used to joke while stealing pieces of turkey before dinner. I smiled sadly at the memory. I could not remember the last time he stood beside me in this kitchen long enough to make a joke. The refrigerator light cast a pale glow across the marble countertops while snow continued falling outside. Connecticut winters always felt endless in houses this large. Beautiful from a distance. Lonely up close. I carried the last dish toward the sink when I noticed something sitting near the coffee station. Sophie's phone. The screen lit up suddenly from an incoming text message. I was not trying to snoop. At least that is what I told myself later. But my eyes moved instinctively toward the screen before I could stop them. Richard. She noticed the binder tonight. There was a pause in my chest so sharp it almost felt physical. Another message appeared seconds later. Sophie. Let me handle her. My fingers tightened around the plate in my hands. I stared at the glowing screen while the dishwasher hummed quietly behind me. Then another message appeared. Richard. We need everything finalized before spring. Sophie. She will never see it coming. The words sat there in bright white letters against a dark screen. Calm. Casual. Planned. I slowly placed the plate down beside the sink because suddenly I did not trust my own hands. Somewhere upstairs the floor creaked again above me. Their footsteps. Their voices. Their private conversations happening inside the house I had spent half my life building. I should have confronted them right then. I should have marched upstairs and demanded answers. But something inside me had shifted during dinner. The frightened part of me was fading. In its place was something quieter. More careful. I picked up Sophie's phone and stared at my own reflection in the black marble countertop beneath the kitchen lights. At 67 years old, my silver hair was neatly pinned back. My face looked tired but steady. Not weak. Never weak. I placed the phone exactly where I found it and turned off the kitchen lights one by one. Then I stood alone in the dark hallway for a long moment, listening to the muffled sound of laughter drifting from upstairs. And for the first time in months I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things. I finally understood the truth. They were not trying to push me aside slowly anymore. They were already planning the life they wanted after I was gone. The next morning, the house smelled faintly of coffee and cedarwood polish, but something about it felt staged now, like a photograph pretending to be a home. I woke before sunrise after barely sleeping at all. Richard's side of the bed had been empty when I reached for him sometime around 3 in the morning. At first I thought he had fallen asleep in his office again, but when I stepped into the hallway, I noticed a thin line of light beneath the guest house door across the snowy courtyard. I stood there for a long moment in silence, my hand resting lightly against the upstairs banister while freezing wind rattled the windows beside me. Then I quietly returned to bed without opening the curtains. By 7 o'clock, Richard was back in the kitchen wearing gray cashmere and reading financial news on his tablet as though nothing unusual had happened. Morning, he said casually while pouring himself coffee. I studied him carefully from across the marble island. 41 years together teaches you how to read the smallest details about someone. The loosened collar. The distracted eyes. The strange overconfidence people wear when they think they are no longer being watched. You are up early, I said evenly. Could not sleep, he replied without looking at me. Sophie entered moments later from the hallway connecting the mudroom to the garage. Not from the guest house direction. Interesting. She wore cream-colored workout clothes and carried a green juice like she had just come back from yoga. Good morning, Evelyn, she said brightly. The roads are awful today. Everything is covered in ice. Richard finally looked up then, just briefly. A tiny glance. But enough. Tiny moments reveal entire truths once you stop ignoring them. Daniel came downstairs 20 minutes later wearing wrinkled clothes and carrying his phone charger. He looked exhausted. Did you sleep downstairs? I asked gently. The television was too loud upstairs, he muttered. Sophie immediately interrupted him. Poor thing was watching the game until 2 in the morning. Daniel looked confused for half a second. Before nodding slowly. I almost felt sorry for him then. Almost. The morning moved strangely after that. Sophie hummed softly while rearranging flowers in a crystal vase near the breakfast nook, as if she already belonged there permanently. Richard took 2 business calls in his office with the door closed. Daniel disappeared into the gym downstairs. And I sat beside the living room windows pretending to read while snow drifted across the frozen backyard fountain. Around noon the landline rang. Almost nobody used the house phone anymore except charities and political campaigns, so I nearly ignored it. But something made me answer anyway. Mrs. Carter? A woman asked politely. This is Margaret Hale. I used to work with your husband years ago. I was hoping we might speak privately. Her voice sounded careful. Measured. Like someone stepping onto thin ice. About what? I asked. There was a short pause on the line. About something you deserve to know before it is too late. My grip tightened around the receiver. Across the room, Sophie laughed at something on her phone while sunlight reflected off her wedding ring. Everything suddenly felt sharp and distant at the same time. I do not understand, I said quietly. I think you already do, Margaret replied softly. We agreed to meet the following afternoon at a small cafe in Westport about 20 minutes from the house. When I hung up, I noticed my hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear. Anticipation. That evening, Richard announced he would be attending a retirement dinner in Manhattan the next night. Sophie immediately offered to accompany him because, according to her, Daniel hates formal events. Daniel did not argue. He barely looked up from his plate anymore during meals. The 3 of them had become actors repeating the same script every night while pretending I was too distracted to notice. But once you finally see manipulation clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee. Every smile feels rehearsed. Every silence becomes deliberate. After dinner, Sophie excused herself upstairs while Richard took another call in his office. Daniel lingered behind awkwardly while I rinsed dishes in the sink. Mom, he said suddenly. I turned toward him. For a moment he looked 12 years old again. Nervous. Guilty. Fragile. Are you happy here? He asked quietly. The question startled me enough that I almost laughed. Happy. Such a strange word for this house now. I dried my hands carefully with a dish towel before answering. Why would you ask me that? Daniel stared down at the kitchen floor. I just think maybe things are changing. There it was again. Changing. Everyone suddenly spoke in vague little phrases now, as though honesty itself had become dangerous inside this family. Your father built this home for us, I said calmly. I have lived here most of my adult life. Daniel nodded slowly but did not respond. Then Sophie's voice floated down the staircase. Daniel? Are you coming? He looked toward the stairs immediately. Instinctively. Like someone being called back into line. Good night, Mom, he murmured before walking away. I stood alone in the kitchen afterward listening to the sound of their footsteps disappear upstairs together. Then my eyes drifted toward Richard's office door at the end of the hallway. Closed. Locked. Silent. And for the first time in years, I realized something deeply unsettling. Whatever they were hiding inside that room was no longer just about money. The cafe in Westport sat on a quiet corner near the harbor, tucked between a bookstore and an old jewelry shop that had been there longer than most marriages survived. Snow still lined the sidewalks in gray slush by the time I arrived the next afternoon. I parked beside the curb and sat inside my car for a moment watching people hurry past in heavy winter coats, carrying paper coffee cups and shopping bags, completely unaware that my entire life seemed to be unraveling one careful thread at a time. Margaret Hale was already inside waiting for me near the back window. I recognized her immediately despite the 20 years that had passed since I last saw her at one of Richard's firm holiday parties. Her hair was shorter now, almost entirely silver, and she wore thin reading glasses low on her nose, but her posture remained sharp and elegant. Margaret had once managed nearly every financial account connected to Richard's law practice before retiring early. Back then, Richard trusted her more than anyone, which suddenly made her presence here feel even more unsettling. "Evelyn," she said softly as I approached the table. "Thank you for coming." I sat down slowly across from her while the waitress poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs. My hands remained folded calmly in my lap even though my pulse had not slowed since the phone call yesterday. Margaret looked at me carefully for a moment before speaking again. "You look exactly the same." I almost smiled at that. Women our age always say things like that to each other when we both know it is not true. "You said there was something I needed to know," I replied quietly. Margaret glanced toward the front windows before lowering her voice. "I struggled with whether to contact you at all. But after what I discovered last month, I could not stay silent anymore." Something cold settled in my stomach. "Discovered what?" She opened a leather folder beside her and slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me. At first glance it looked like ordinary legal documentation. Trust revisions, asset transfers, property restructuring. Then I noticed the names. Richard Carter, Sophie Carter. Multiple transfers dated over the last 11 months. And nowhere on the page was my signature. "This cannot be legal," I whispered. Margaret's expression tightened slightly. "Some of it is. Some of it is not." Outside, snow began drifting lightly again beyond the cafe windows. The world looked strangely peaceful while mine quietly collapsed beneath me. "Richard has been moving assets for over a year," Margaret continued carefully. "Investment accounts, real estate interests, retirement distributions. At first I assumed it was normal estate planning. Then Sophie's name started appearing on internal authorization drafts. I stared at the documents while heat from the untouched coffee rose between us. Why would he involve Sophie? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Margaret hesitated only briefly. "Because she is more involved in this than you realize." My chest tightened painfully then. Not from shock. Anymore. Confirmation. Deep down, I think women always know long before we allow ourselves to admit the truth. We simply spend years explaining away what our instincts already understand. "Daniel knows?" I asked softly. Margaret removed her glasses and rubbed them carefully with a napkin before answering. "I honestly cannot tell how much your son understands. But I know this much, Evelyn. Richard has been preparing for a major restructuring of the family trust by spring. Spring. The same word from Sophie's text message. We need everything finalized before spring." Suddenly the room felt smaller. Colder. "What exactly is he planning?" I asked. Margaret looked directly at me then, and for the first time since sitting down, I saw genuine pity in her eyes. "I believe he intends to remove you from primary control of nearly everything." The sounds inside the cafe blurred together after that. Espresso machines steaming. Silverware clinking softly against plates. A couple laughing near the front counter. Ordinary life continuing while I sat frozen beside the harbor listening to a stranger explain how my husband was quietly erasing me from the future we built together. "There is more," Margaret said carefully. She reached into her folder again and removed a small folded note. "A month ago, Richard asked me to retrieve archived documents from a private storage file connected to his office." My eyes moved toward the note in her hand. Inside was a sealed digital backup request. Password protected. He became furious when he realized the file could not be located. "What kind of file?" I asked. Margaret shook her head slowly. "I do not know. But I know Richard well enough to recognize fear when I see it. Whatever was inside that file mattered enough to make him panic." Panic? Richard Carter did not panic. Not during court trials. Not during financial crashes. Not even during Daniel's terrible skiing accident years ago in Vermont. Richard controlled every emotion with terrifying precision. Unless something threatened him personally. Margaret leaned closer across the table. Evelyn, I think there is something hidden somewhere inside that house. Something he never intended anyone to find. I stared silently at the falling snow outside while her words echoed through my mind. Then very slowly I thought about the locked office, the missing documents, the late-night whispers, the text messages. And suddenly, for the first time since all of this began, I stopped feeling like a confused wife watching her marriage disappear. I started feeling like someone being deliberately managed, carefully isolated, quietly replaced. And if Margaret was right, then somewhere inside my own home was the reason why. When I pulled into the driveway that evening, the house glowed warmly against the dark Connecticut sky like something out of a magazine advertisement for perfect family living. The stone pathway lights reflected softly off the snow, and smoke curled gently from the chimney above the east wing. From the outside, nothing had changed. That was the unsettling part. Betrayal rarely announces itself loudly at first. Most of the time it hides inside ordinary routines until one day you realize every familiar thing around you has been quietly rearranged without your permission. I sat in my car for a moment gripping the steering wheel while Margaret's words repeated themselves over and over in my head. He is preparing to remove you from primary control of nearly everything. Somewhere inside that house was a hidden file important enough to frighten Richard Carter. And suddenly, after months of feeling confused and emotionally exhausted, I finally had something solid to hold on to. Not proof yet, but direction. Inside, the kitchen smelled of rosemary chicken and garlic bread. Sophie stood at the stove stirring sauce in one of my copper pans while soft music played from the ceiling speakers. She turned with a bright smile the second I walked in. "There you are," she said warmly. "We were starting to worry." Such a dangerous little word. Richard sat at the kitchen island reviewing papers while Daniel scrolled silently through his phone nearby. All three looked up at me with identical expressions that felt practiced somehow. Measured. Careful. "Traffic near Fairfield was terrible," I replied calmly as I removed my gloves. Sophie tilted her head. "Slightly. You drove all the way to Fairfield?" There it was. Too quick. Too interested. I smiled faintly while hanging my coat. I stopped to shop for a few things. Her eyes lingered on me half a second too long before she returned to the stove. Richard folded his papers neatly and studied me over the rim of his reading glasses. "You should have told someone where you were going," he said. "We were concerned." Concern. That word again. Everyone suddenly seemed very concerned about me lately. My whereabouts. My stress levels. My future plans. I walked toward the sink slowly and noticed something immediately. The family portrait that normally sat beside the window had been moved. It was a photograph from Daniel's graduation at Yale nearly 15 years ago. Richard stood proudly beside him in a navy suit, while I wrapped my arm around Daniel's shoulders. Sophie had not entered our lives yet back then. Now the frame sat pushed near the far corner beside a stack of unopened mail, almost hidden from view. In its place was a newer photograph from Christmas last year. Richard and Sophie stood side by side in the center while Daniel smiled stiffly near the edge. I was seated farther back on the sofa, partially obscured by the tree. It looked less like a family portrait and more like evidence of a slow replacement already underway. "I reorganized the kitchen decor today," Sophie said lightly, noticing my eyes drift toward the frames. "I thought this looked more updated." Updated. Another carefully chosen word. Richard resumed reviewing his paperwork while dinner plates were set out across the island instead of the dining room. Small changes. Deliberate changes. Sophie no longer even pretended to ask my opinion before making decisions inside the house. During dinner, Richard discussed plans for spring renovations near the lake property in Vermont. Except he spoke about them entirely with Sophie. Countertops. Guest suites. Landscaping. Wine storage. It was the kind of conversation married couples usually have privately after years of building a life together. Daniel barely contributed at all. He simply nodded whenever Sophie glanced toward him. At one point Richard laughed quietly at something she said while reaching naturally toward her wrist. The gesture lasted only a second, barely noticeable. But I noticed the sudden silence that followed when they both realized I had seen it. Daniel lowered his fork immediately. Sophie pulled her hand away and reached for her water glass instead. Richard cleared his throat. "You have not eaten much tonight, Evelyn." "I am not very hungry," I replied evenly. The room fell quiet after that except for soft jazz drifting through the speakers overhead. I looked around the kitchen slowly. My kitchen. The room where I hosted birthdays, graduations, Christmas dinners, and Sunday breakfasts for decades. Yet somehow I felt more invisible there than I had ever felt anywhere in my life. Then Sophie broke the silence with a voice so gentle it almost sounded compassionate. "Richard and I were actually discussing something earlier today that might help take some pressure off you." My eyes lifted toward her calmly. "Oh." She exchanged a quick glance with Richard before continuing. "There is a beautiful assisted living community opening near Greenwich in the spring. Luxury apartments, wellness programs, gardening clubs. They even have private dining and shuttle service into the city." For one strange second, nobody moved. Not Daniel. Not Richard. Not even me. I simply stared at Sophie while her words floated softly through the warm kitchen air like smoke. Assisted living. There it was. Not implied anymore. Not hidden beneath vague concern or polite suggestions. Spoken directly across my own dinner table by the woman slowly taking over my life. Daniel finally shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Soph," he muttered quietly. But Sophie continued smiling at me with calm confidence. "We just want you to be comfortable, Evelyn." Comfortable. I folded my napkin carefully beside my untouched plate and looked directly at Richard. He did not deny it. He did not look shocked. He simply sat there in silence while Sophie discussed where I should spend the remainder of my life. And in that moment, something inside me became perfectly clear. They were no longer planning around me. They were planning for after me. After dinner, Sophie cleared the plates with unnatural cheerfulness while Richard disappeared into his office without saying another word about assisted living. Daniel lingered near the staircase for a moment like he wanted to speak, but whatever remained of his courage vanished the second Sophie called his name from the kitchen. I watched him walk toward her without hesitation. That hurt more than I expected. Betrayal from a husband was devastating. Betrayal from your own child hollowed something much deeper. Around 10 o'clock, the house finally grew quiet. Snow continued falling outside in soft waves beneath the backyard lanterns, while the heating system hummed steadily through the walls. Richard always fell asleep quickly after whiskey. Tonight was no different. I listened carefully from my bedroom as the sounds upstairs slowly disappeared one by one. A bathroom door closing. Floorboards creaking softly. The distant murmur of the television downstairs fading into silence. Then nothing. I waited another full hour before moving. At 67 years old, I never imagined I would one day sneak through my own home like an intruder. I wrapped a cream-colored cardigan tightly around myself and stepped into the dark hallway barefoot. The marble floors felt cold beneath my feet as moonlight spilled faintly through the tall windows overlooking the courtyard. Richard's office sat at the end of the hall exactly where it always had. Closed. Locked. Untouchable. Except tonight something felt different. Earlier during dinner, I noticed Richard become distracted when his phone rang. He stood too quickly and rushed upstairs before Sophie followed moments later. In their hurry, neither of them seemed to notice the small brass key Richard left sitting beside the hallway console table afterward. I slipped the key carefully into the office door now and held my breath. The lock clicked open instantly. For a second, I simply stood there staring into the darkness beyond the doorway. The office smelled faintly of leather, cedar, and Richard's cologne. Familiar scents from a man I no longer recognized. Moonlight stretched across the polished desk near the windows while shelves of legal books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Everything looked perfectly organized at first glance. Too organized. Richard had always been meticulous, but this room felt staged now. Controlled. I stepped inside quietly and closed the door behind me. Margaret's voice echoed in my mind. Somewhere inside that house was something he never intended anyone to find. I moved slowly through the office, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. Financial binders sat arranged alphabetically across the shelves. Locked filing drawers lined the far wall beside framed awards from Richard's legal career. Family photographs once displayed across the desk had mostly disappeared. In their place sat architectural sketches for the Vermont property renovations Sophie discussed during dinner. I stared at them for a long moment before opening the top desk drawer. Empty except for pens and stationery. The second drawer contained tax records. The third held old passports and insurance documents. Nothing unusual. But then I noticed something strange near the bookshelf beside the fireplace. One section of the walnut paneling looked slightly newer than the rest. Barely noticeable unless you lived in the house long enough to recognize every detail. My pulse quickened. I crossed the room slowly and ran my fingertips along the wood until they brushed against a tiny recessed metal edge hidden near the molding. A concealed wall safe. Of course. Richard loved hidden compartments. He once spent 6 months designing a secret wine cellar entrance in our Vermont property, simply because he enjoyed the idea of privacy disguised as elegance. I crouched carefully beside the panel and studied the keypad. 4 digits. I tried Richard's birthday first. Nothing. Then Daniel's. Nothing. My eyes drifted toward the framed photo sitting alone on the bookshelf nearby. It showed Sophie standing beside Richard during a charity gala last spring. She was smiling directly at him while his hand rested lightly against her back. The date beneath the frame caught my attention immediately. April 14th. I stared at it for several seconds before entering the numbers into the keypad. The safe unlocked instantly. For a moment I could not breathe. Inside sat several folders, a stack of cash, 2 passports, and a black external hard drive labeled Private Archive. My hands trembled slightly as I removed it from the safe. Beneath the drive rested another folder marked Care Transition Plan. Slowly I opened it. The first page was enough to turn my blood cold. It outlined recommendations for relocating me into assisted living care by late spring pending revised trust authorization. Attached were financial projections estimating maintenance savings after transferring primary residence ownership. Ownership. Not care. Not concern. Removal. I turned the page carefully. Then another. Legal drafts. Medical evaluations requested without my knowledge. Power of attorney revisions. Sophie's name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents beside Richard's signature. My chest tightened painfully as the truth finally settled into place completely. They had not simply been discussing my future. They had been planning my disappearance from this family piece by piece for months. Then I connected the hard drive to Richard's office computer. Several password attempts failed before I finally entered Sophie's birthday almost instinctively. The files opened immediately. Audio recordings. Financial spreadsheets. Scanned legal transfers. And one video file dated 7 months earlier. I clicked play. Richard's voice filled the dark office almost instantly. Calm. Cold. Familiar. Daniel does not need to know everything yet, he said. Sophie laughed softly somewhere off camera. He barely notices anything anyway. Richard chuckled quietly in return. Once Evelyn signs the revised documents, the transition will be simple. I stared at the glowing screen while the blood drained slowly from my face. Then Sophie's voice answered clearly through the speakers. And if she refuses? There was a short silence before Richard spoke again. By then, nobody will believe she is capable of managing things herself. For several seconds, I sat frozen in Richard's leather chair staring at the glowing computer screen while his words echoed through the office like something poisonous slowly spreading through the walls. Nobody will believe she is capable of managing things herself. I replayed the sentence twice more just to make sure I had heard it correctly. Each time his voice sounded colder, more clinical, like a man discussing numbers on a spreadsheet instead of the woman who had spent 41 years beside him. Sophie laughed softly again somewhere in the recording. You really think she will sign everything willingly? Richard sighed. Evelyn has always trusted me. That is what makes this easy. Easy. I closed the laptop carefully because suddenly I could not bear hearing another word. The office felt smaller now. Suffocating. Moonlight spilled across the hardwood floor while snow tapped softly against the windows overlooking the courtyard. Somewhere upstairs, Richard was asleep peacefully while his entire secret life sat hidden inside the room he thought I would never enter. My first instinct was to cry. To scream. To march upstairs and force them to look me in the eyes while explaining how they justified this level of cruelty. But that feeling passed almost immediately. In its place came something much more dangerous. Calm. I removed the hard drive carefully and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan, along with several documents from the safe. Then I locked everything exactly as I found it. By the time I returned upstairs, my hands had stopped trembling completely. I slept beside Richard that night without making a sound. He rolled toward me once around dawn, half asleep, resting his hand lightly against my shoulder the same way he had done for decades. I stared silently at the ceiling while his breathing slowed again beside me. The familiarity of that touch somehow hurt more than the betrayal itself. The next morning, I behaved exactly the way they expected me to behave. Quiet, pleasant, slightly distracted. Sophie prepared breakfast smoothies while discussing spring charity events. Richard complained about the stock market over coffee. Daniel barely spoke at all. And I smiled through every conversation like a woman too emotionally exhausted to notice her own life being dismantled around her. That was the moment everything shifted in my favor. Because once people decide you are weak, they stop watching you carefully. Around 11 o'clock, Richard left for a lunch meeting in Stamford while Sophie drove into town for a spa appointment. Before leaving, she kissed Daniel lightly on the cheek near the kitchen doorway while Richard stood nearby pretending not to notice. Tiny moments. Tiny betrayals. The kind that become impossible to ignore once the illusion finally breaks. The second their cars disappeared down the driveway, I went upstairs and called the only person I could still trust completely. Harold Bennett speaking, the voice answered after 2 rings. Harold had been our family attorney for nearly 25 years before retiring from Richard's firm. More importantly, he had known me long before Richard became successful enough to believe consequences no longer applied to him. "Harold," I said quietly, "I need your help." There was a brief pause on the line. "Evelyn." His voice immediately softened with concern. "Is everything all right?" I looked out the bedroom window toward the snow-covered courtyard below where Sophie's designer scarf still hung forgotten across one of the patio chairs. "No," I answered honestly. "I do not believe it is." 2 hours later, I sat inside Harold's private office overlooking the Long Island Sound, while he reviewed copies of the files I had printed that morning from Richard's hard drive. The older man removed his glasses slowly after reading the assisted living documents. "Good Lord," he muttered under his breath. I sat quietly across from him with both hands wrapped around untouched tea. "Can they actually do this?" I asked calmly. Harold's expression darkened. "Some of these trust revisions are legitimate drafts, but others raise serious legal and ethical concerns." He tapped one of the pages sharply. "Especially these competency evaluations. You were never examined by any physician connected to this paperwork." "No," I replied softly. "I was not." Harold leaned back heavily in his chair. "Richard is being extremely reckless." Reckless. Such a polite word for betrayal. I reached into my purse and removed the hard drive carefully before sliding it across the desk toward him. "There is more." Harold spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing the recordings and financial files in complete silence. The longer he listened, the more unsettled he became. Finally, he closed the laptop slowly and looked directly at me. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "your husband has already transferred substantial assets connected to joint marital holdings without proper disclosure. Can it be stopped?" I asked. Harold's eyes hardened slightly behind his glasses. "Yes, but only if we move immediately." Outside his office windows, dark clouds gathered slowly over the water while late afternoon sunlight faded across the harbor. I suddenly realized I no longer felt frightened. Hurt, yes. Angry, absolutely. But not frightened. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I finally understood something important. Richard and Sophie believed they were managing a confused older woman too emotional to protect herself. They believed silence meant surrender. What they did not understand was that I had spent 41 years beside one of the most calculating attorneys in Connecticut. And if Richard had taught me anything during our marriage, it was this. The most dangerous person in the room is usually the one speaking the least. 3 days later, Richard announced he wanted to host a private family dinner on Saturday evening to discuss what he called important transitions moving forward. The phrase alone told me everything I needed to know. He thought he was ready to finalize whatever carefully staged future he and Sophie had been planning behind closed doors for months. And because they believed I remained confused, emotional, and powerless, Neither of them noticed how calm I had suddenly become. Saturday arrived wrapped in freezing rain and low gray clouds hanging over the Connecticut shoreline. By late afternoon, the house glowed warmly beneath soft exterior lights while staff from a local catering company arranged polished serving trays across the dining room buffet. Richard always performed confidence publicly when he believed he had already won privately. Sophie moved through the house in a fitted ivory dress, giving instructions to caterers like a woman. Rehearsing for ownership. She adjusted floral arrangements, approved wine selections, and even replaced the dining room candles I normally used with taller gold ones she claimed looked more modern. Daniel spent most of the afternoon avoiding everyone entirely. He wandered through rooms with the exhausted expression of a man who sensed disaster approaching, but lacked the courage to stop it. Around 6 o'clock, guests began arriving. Richard invited 2 senior partners from his former law firm, Daniel's financial advisor, a few longtime family friends, and Harold Bennett himself. Richard nearly froze when he saw Harold step through the front door beside me, but only for half a second. Then the polished attorney returned immediately. "Harold," Richard said smoothly while extending his hand, "I did not realize you would be joining us." Harold smiled pleasantly. Evelyn insisted. Sophie stood nearby holding a champagne glass so tightly I noticed the tension in her fingers immediately. She recovered quickly though. That was one thing about Sophie. She understood performance almost as well as Richard did. Dinner began with the usual polished conversations wealthy people use to avoid sincerity. Market conditions, vacation properties, retirement investments, snow forecasts in Vermont. Through it all, I sat quietly near the center of the long mahogany table, wearing a dark blue silk dress Richard once bought me in Charleston years ago, when we still traveled like people in love. Sophie barely looked at me directly all evening. Richard looked too often. Halfway through dinner, he finally cleared his throat softly and rested both hands against the table. The room gradually fell silent. "As many of you know," he began smoothly, "our family has been discussing certain structural changes regarding estate planning and future care arrangements." Future care arrangements. Such elegant language for betrayal. Sophie lowered her eyes modestly while Daniel stared down into his wine glass. Richard continued speaking in the calm professional tone that made juries trust him for decades. "Evelyn has understandably struggled these past few years with stress and the responsibilities of managing such a large household." I noticed Harold watching him carefully from across the table without saying a word. "After many thoughtful conversations," Richard continued, "we believe it may be time to simplify certain obligations moving forward." There it was. The performance. The gentle public framing designed to make my removal sound compassionate instead of calculated. Sophie finally added softly, "We all just want what is best for Evelyn." I almost admired how naturally she lied. Almost. The room remained quiet for several seconds before I slowly set down my wine glass. "That is very thoughtful of you," I said calmly. Richard relaxed almost instantly. Sophie did too. They thought surrender had finally arrived. "Actually," I continued softly, "there is something I would like everyone to hear before any decisions are finalized tonight." Richard's expression shifted slightly then. Not fear yet, but uncertainty. I reached calmly into my purse and removed a small black flash drive before placing it gently beside my plate. Daniel frowned immediately. Sophie went completely still. "Evelyn," Richard said carefully, "this really is not necessary." I looked directly at him for the first time all evening. "I think it is." Harold quietly connected the flash drive to the dining room media system without a single word. Then Richard's voice suddenly filled the room through the hidden ceiling speakers. Clear. Cold. Unmistakable. Once Evelyn signs the revised documents, the transition will be simple. Every sound inside the dining room disappeared instantly. Sophie's face drained of color. Daniel looked up sharply in confusion. Richard stood so quickly his chair scraped harshly across the hardwood floor. Then Sophie's voice followed through the speakers. "And if she refuses?" Silence spread across the table like smoke before Richard answered calmly through the recording. "By then, nobody will believe she is capable of managing things herself." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed properly. I watched Daniel's expression collapse in real time, as realization slowly replaced confusion. "What is this?" he whispered hoarsely. Richard looked toward the media controls. Immediately. Turn that off. But Harold did not move. More recordings followed. Asset transfers. Discussions about the assisted living facility. Sophie laughing about how easy it had become to manipulate household decisions. Richard explaining legal strategies for restructuring trust ownership before spring. Every polished lie they carefully maintained inside this house began collapsing publicly, one sentence at a time. Daniel pushed back from the table, staring between his father and wife like a man suddenly unable to recognize either of them. "You told me Mom was overwhelmed," he said quietly. Sophie's lips parted but no words came out. Richard finally looked at me directly then, and for the first time in 41 years together, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Fear. Because at that exact moment he realized something devastating. The woman he thought was quietly disappearing had been listening the entire time. Nobody touched dessert that night. The dining room remained frozen in stunned silence long after the recordings stopped playing through the speakers. Outside, freezing rain tapped steadily against the tall windows while candlelight flickered across faces that no longer knew where to look. Daniel sat motionless at the table, staring at his father like someone grieving a death he never saw coming. Sophie finally broke first. "Richard," she whispered sharply, her composure cracking for the first time since I met her. "Do something." But Richard no longer looked like the polished attorney who controlled every room he entered. He looked tired. Older somehow. Smaller. He loosened his tie slowly and turned toward me with an expression I could no longer recognize as love. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "you do not understand the full context of those conversations." I almost smiled at that. After 41 years together, this was still his instinct. Control the narrative. Reframe the truth. Make reality sound negotiable. Harold folded his hands calmly near the end of the table. "The recordings are quite clear, Richard." Sophie stood abruptly from her chair. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her polished warmth finally gone. "Completely. You invaded private files and twisted everything out of proportion." Daniel looked toward her slowly then. "Out of proportion?" His voice sounded hollow. "You talked about sending my mother away like she was an inconvenience." Sophie crossed her arms tightly. "Your mother needed help." "No," Daniel said quietly. "You needed her gone." The room fell silent again. I watched my son carefully in that moment. He looked exhausted, broken. But for the first time in months, he was finally seeing the truth without Sophie speaking over it. Richard pushed back from the table heavily and turned toward Harold. "Legally, none of this changes anything." Harold's expression remained perfectly calm. "Actually, it changes quite a lot." Richard's jaw tightened instantly. Harold continued evenly. "The asset transfers connected to joint holdings have already been frozen pending investigation. Several revised trust filings will also be challenged immediately." Sophie's face lost what little color remained. "Frozen," she repeated softly. Harold nodded once. "As of yesterday afternoon." I said nothing. That was the part that unsettled Richard most. My silence. He kept looking toward me throughout the conversation, waiting for anger or tears or emotional collapse. Something familiar he could still manage. But I had already cried weeks earlier when I first realized the truth. What remained now was clarity. One by one, the dinner guests quietly excused themselves from the table with uncomfortable murmurs and lowered eyes. Nobody wanted to remain inside a collapsing illusion longer than necessary. Within 20 minutes, only the four of us remained in the dining room along with Harold. Snow had started falling again outside, soft and heavy beneath the courtyard lights. Sophie suddenly turned toward me with desperation flashing across her face. "Evelyn, please," she said quickly. "You know Richard and I never meant to hurt you. Richard and I. Not Daniel and I. Not the family. Just the two of them." Even now, standing in the ruins of their secrets, they instinctively moved together. I looked directly at her for several long seconds before answering quietly. "You stopped being believable the moment you started calling my removal concern." Sophie opened her mouth again but no words came out. Daniel stood slowly from the table then. "Were you sleeping with my father?" he asked her softly. Nobody answered immediately. That silence told him everything. Daniel closed his eyes briefly like the truth itself physically hurt. Richard finally spoke. Daniel, this situation is complicated. No, Daniel interrupted quietly. It really is not. He looked at me then, and for the first time in months, I saw shame fully settle into his face. Mom, he whispered. I did not know. I believed him. That was the tragedy of it all. Daniel had been weak, passive, easily manipulated. But he had not understood how deep the betrayal truly went until tonight. I stood slowly from my chair and smoothed the front of my navy dress carefully. The room felt strangely peaceful now. Not happy, not victorious, just finished. I spent years believing loyalty meant enduring everything quietly, I said softly. I thought keeping this family together mattered more than being respected inside it. Richard stared at me without speaking. But loyalty without honesty is just another form of loneliness. Sophie lowered her eyes. Daniel looked shattered. And Richard finally looked like a man realizing consequences had arrived too late to negotiate away. Harold gathered his folders calmly while I walked toward the staircase. Halfway up, I stopped briefly and looked back down at the dining room where I had spent decades hosting holidays, birthdays, and family dinners for people who slowly learned to mistake my kindness for weakness. The house will be listed in the spring, I said quietly. My attorneys will handle the details. Richard's face hardened immediately. You cannot possibly intend to destroy everything over one misunderstanding. I looked at him for a long moment beneath the chandelier light. No, Richard, I answered softly. You already did that yourselves. 2 months later, I left Connecticut just after sunrise with 3 suitcases packed neatly in the trunk of my car. The divorce proceedings were still ongoing. Several financial investigations had expanded beyond what Richard expected. Sophie disappeared from the family entirely before the first court date even arrived. Daniel called me twice a week now from a small apartment downtown, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. Healing would take years for him, maybe longer. As for me, I bought a small historic home near the water in Charleston with white shutters, and a wide porch where I now drink coffee each morning while church bells echo softly through the streets. The silence there feels different, gentle, honest. Sometimes I still think about that dining room in Connecticut, and the people who once sat around it pretending I was too old to notice the truth unfolding directly in front of me. But they misunderstood something important about women like me. We notice everything. We simply wait until we are ready to stop forgiving it.